Welcome to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we're talking with Jonathan Zur. He is the president and CEO of Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities. It's a statewide organization with an 85-year history here in the Commonwealth, which might surprise you because it certainly surprised me. Welcome, Jonathan. I am so glad to have you here on this show and to introduce the work of VCIC to more people here in Northern Virginia.
Well, thank you, Catherine. It's a real treat to get to chat with you and really appreciate the opportunity.
So you came on my radar because I saw something that came up on LinkedIn, and it said that the Atlantic Union Bank had given you, the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, the biggest grant in your 85-year history. And I'm like, 85-year history? And I have never heard of them. And so I reached out to your organization going, how could I not know about the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities? I've lived in this Commonwealth my entire life, and I work in this space. And then digging a little bit deeper, I came to understand that your work actually started out in 1935 under a different name, doing interfaith work. So walk our listeners through a little bit of the history of VCIC.
I'll be happy to. And yeah, we've gone through a few name changes. So you're not the only person who has said over the years, oh, I didn't know about this name, but happy to learn about the history and the work. So we were founded in 1935 in Virginia when a group that was known as the Tolerance Trio had been traveling the country. They were a rabbi, priest, and minister team. It sounds like a bad joke, but it actually is a true story. Yep. And they were speaking out in the 1920s and 30s in response to a documented rise in anti-Semitism of that time period, anti-Catholicism of that time period. Al Smith was the first major party candidate to run for president in 1928 who identified as Catholic, and there was a rise in anti-Catholicism. There was xenophobia that was on the rise, anti-immigrant sentiment certainly. Racism continued to be a scourge. And so these religious leaders became known as the Tolerance Trio and went all over the country speaking out about the importance of understanding and respect. And they went to large cities and small communities. In many places, when they visited, they would get a large turnout, and people would say that it was the first time they'd met someone who was Jewish or met someone who was Catholic, and they could ask their questions and dispel some of the stereotypes. And they were invited to speak in Lynchburg, Virginia, of all places, on November 25th, 1935. The president of then Lynchburg College, now the University of Lynchburg, convened a day-long forum to focus on interfaith understanding. They had elected officials, they had educators, they had clergy there from all over Virginia. Nearly 1,000 people came out to this event. And those who were in attendance were so inspired by what they heard that they went back to their homes and their schools, their workplaces, and their communities and said, we need to have an organization doing this work in Virginia. So we launched as the Virginia office of the National Conference of Christians and Jews, NCCJ, which was the organization that was sponsoring the Tolerance Trio's travels all across the country. NCCJ's work was interfaith in nature, and so the organization was doing a lot of work to bring together different faith communities during World War II. And in the aftermath, there was a lot of messaging that was being put out around, they would use the language of brotherhood at the time and the importance of Judeo-Christian principles and values. That phrase really comes out of the work of the Tolerance Trio and similar movements of the time period. And over time, the organization recognized that we needed to use the values and principles that had guided our founding to think more expansively. And so we couldn't say we are only going to be for interfaith understanding and not respond to the racism of the Jim Crow era. We couldn't say that we were going to only focus on some issues and not address other issues. And so over time, our work broadened and evolved. NCCJ at the national level went through a few name changes. At one point, they became the National Conference for Community and Justice, thinking that they could keep the NCCJ initials, but change what it represented. And then about 15 years ago, in the early 2000s, the National NCCJ organization closed. And at that point, our board in Virginia had a choice to make about whether we wanted to stay as an independent nonprofit, whether we wanted to close, whether we wanted to merge with other groups doing this work. And the board at the time decided that we would relaunch as the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, which is a mouthful of a name. And I think it reflects more accurately the work that our predecessors and my colleagues and I today have been doing now since 1935.
And truly, you work with schools, businesses, and communities on inclusivity. And when we think about that, it kind of has evolved and changed over a period of time, from anti-Semitism, thinking about Jim Crow, which has been with us forever, but certainly exploded after the death of George Floyd. But you've done gang work in schools too. And again, things tend to shift. It used to be, especially I can tell you here in Northern Virginia, gangs in schools were a huge thing. It's not like they've gone anywhere. They haven't gone anywhere. It's just suddenly the focus and the narrative and the media and everybody else who works in schools and in communities is focused on something else. And that is racial equity and racial justice and the subtle ways in which it's institutionalized, because all of us are complicit, and we are complicit without thinking we're racist. And so you're talking about people who've lived their whole lives going, I'm not racist, and don't understand the very subtle ways in which we institutionalize things like racism and also ageism. I was interested in the fact that you participated in an interview with Steve Petro in the Washington Post on December 19th. And you were talking about how ageism is also a way in which people who are older are excluded or marginalized. And so I just want people to understand it is more than just racial equity and racial justice, even though I think that you're on a lot of people's radars because of that. You have actually been doing this work for a long time.
Yeah, and our work is intentionally multi-issue and intersectional. And so we think about issues connected to race, class, gender, religion, sexual orientation, immigration, age, abilities and disabilities. I mean, the range of issues are broad, and really what we think about are how we can combat prejudice in all of its forms. And so with students in schools, a lot of that work is around addressing bullying, for example, or thinking about how influences like gang activity can create a hostile, maybe sometimes even a violent climate. But if students feel a sense of belonging in schools, if they see themselves reflected in the curriculum, if they don't fear bullying from a classmate, if they feel a connection to an adult, then they're not going to be seeking out the belonging that they might find from gang activity or some other negative sources. And so we really help schools to think about how they can be places of belonging through student workshops when we're not in a pandemic. That includes retreats, that includes bringing students together for one-day forums. Now all of that work is being done virtually, as well as a lot of professional development, a lot of work with teachers, helping them to think about, explore ways to ensure that they're engaging in culturally relevant curriculum and effective classroom management or family engagement. And then at the policy level, when we look at things like racial equity, as you named, certainly we want to look at with schools disproportionate discipline. We want to think about tracking into who's going into honors and AP classes and who's not. There are all kinds of policy implications there. And that's just in schools. We do similar work with workplaces and businesses, as well as with localities and municipalities.
Well, you've hit some hot button issues here in Fairfax County with Thomas Jefferson High School. And that's just been it's a huge thing. For those of you who are just joining us, this is Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and today we're talking with Jonathan Zuhr. He is the president and CEO of the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities. And so you just hit on a lot of things about the work that you have been doing, the work that you are continuing to do. And one of the reasons I wanted to do the show with you is so that people understand that you're a resource. And some of the work you do is collaboratively. In other words, you know, we have communities and schools here in Virginia. I mean, we have the SCIPT program in Fairfax County. And so all of these organizations who are doing on the ground work also need resources to bring in as the subject matter experts that they're looking for. So talk a little bit about how you're collaborating.
We work with tons of nonprofits. And one of the things that I say often and have said certainly quite a bit in the last 6 months is there is so much work to be done I don't think any one of us can own the commitment to a more equitable, inclusive, just Commonwealth of Virginia. So I think it really requires partnerships. There's a great quote from Glenn Harris, who leads a national organization called Race Forward. And he says that equity is both a process and an outcome. And what he means by that is that if we don't have an equitable process, if we're truly not working with others, listening to others, centering the voices most impacted by whatever the issue is, then we're not going to have an equitable outcome. I'll often ask people when describing this, have you ever been in a meeting where it felt like the decision had already been made, but they brought a bunch of folks together to offer input, they nodded and smiled and then did what they were going to do anyway? And inevitably everyone nods or raises their hand and says, I've been there. Well, that's not an equitable process. And so you're obviously not going to then have an equitable outcome. And so our work is in partnership with others to be a facilitator. Sometimes it's around being an objective outside group that knows Virginia well, but may not know your specific school or community or issue as well as someone who's there, but can be a semi-objective voice to be able to help folks. We've worked with schools around name changes or mascot changes, for example, in the last few years. In other contexts, it might be helping a business to think about a policy change or a municipality to think about what they might do in terms of their human rights ordinance or anti-discrimination policies to include LGBTQ plus people. So the range of work, again, can be sort of broad, but people often call on the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities because they're looking for a trusted partner who can be a facilitator, a convener, an educator, and who really gets to know your context and community so that we can build trusting reciprocal partnerships with those who are on the ground in your corner of Virginia.
You know, it's interesting because every time you say something, it's like I'm nodding my head. The local middle school up the street from me is changing its name from Sydney Lanier Middle School to Katherine Johnson Middle School. And I mean, we have our own little school board here in our city of Fairfax. It's in the middle of a huge county, but we do our own thing. And again, I mean, there was a lot of discussion. It was opened to the people who live here, all 23,000 of those residents of the city of Fairfax, to really talk about what it meant, why the name was being changed. You know, a lot of times people are like, well, you're rewriting history. Well, no, the history that we're looking at is 4 years out of a 400-year history. So we're not rewriting it. We're saying there's a lot more history we would love to talk about and raise up and honor than 4 years of a very narrow narrative. And so again, I mean, these are fraught conversations, and yet I think you grow. All of us are going to grow as a community, as individuals, and we're doing something important for helping our children to understand how we grapple with difficult topics and how change happens. So I'm interested in, after George Floyd, what happened in Richmond, the fact that Richmond and the Robert E. Lee statue is on the cover of National Geographic. What a statement to make. I mean, Virginia is the epicenter, the 1619 Project. We were talking before we started the show about Hannah Nicole Jones and the work she did with 1619. Not everybody embraces that, but it's important that we just forge ahead. So, do you wait for groups to contact you, or how are you raising up the visibility of some of your programs? Who do you hope to reach?
Yeah, so in the last year, in calendar year 2020, we facilitated over 500 different programs. So certainly there was a period of time when the pandemic first hit, when everything was on pause. But we more than made up for that, unfortunately, after the tragic killing of George Floyd and the killings of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and others known and unknown. We saw a significant increase in requests and demand. And so now every day, our team at VCIC is facilitating sessions for multiple institutions across Virginia. Our hope is that the work that we're doing is proactive in nature. And so it's helping folks to learn. And we think about our training programs as really linking the head, the heart, and the hand. So we try to make sure that there is content knowledge and theory and research behind what we do. That's the head piece. There's the heart. So we're thinking about our personal experiences, our feelings, our making meaning of the similarities or differences that we hear in the room. Folks say, well, I've thought about race my entire life. And the next person says, well, I started thinking about it last summer. That's not a moment to necessarily be in a blame or guilt phase, but it's an opportunity to say, well, let's make meaning of that. How can that be? And what does that mean then for how the two of you work together, how the two of you coexist in the same community? How can we respond not by judging folks necessarily, but with a sense of wonder to try and make meaning of that? And then the hand piece is really around skills. So helping folks to build long range skills. So when we do that, we're then moving from a one-time check off the box, quote unquote, diversity training, which I think all the research shows is not effective or sustainable in the long term, to really long-term relationships with institutions where they can see skill building for individuals and policy and practice changes at the institutional level. So that's the proactive work. We've also, unfortunately, had to do quite a bit of reactive work. So if we think about Virginia in the last few years, you mentioned Monument Avenue in Richmond and the Robert E. Lee statue, and certainly there are statues across Virginia. There are street names that are being changed, school names, things like that. But we also had the governor's yearbook photo, a year and a half ago. We had, or 2 years ago now, we had Charlottesville in August 2017. So we've had a number of flashpoint moments, particularly around race and then around the country. We had the Tree of Life synagogue shooting. We've had the Pulse nightclub shooting. There have been a number of cases where folks have really started to recognize, wow, I need to do something. Wow, I need to learn more. Wow, I need to educate myself. And so oftentimes they'll call our organization as a resource or partner in that work.
For those of you who are just joining us, this is Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I am your host, Catherine Reed, and it is my pleasure to be talking with Jonathan Zuhr, who is the president and CEO of the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, because these are such important issues. And I don't know of a single community anywhere who is not grappling with some of these big questions. It goes beyond monuments and changing the names of schools and streets, although that's sort of a symptom or a manifestation of institutionalized racism and ageism, or as you said, there's so many things. I've done shows on this radio show about the school to prison pipeline, about the disability community. There's so many ways in which we marginalize people. And you're right, intersectionality is so important to help people understand that some of our outlooks or perspectives contribute to this, and we're not aware of it. As you said, it's not about judging people. It's like, let me help you see it through just a different perspective than the one that you have been using your entire life.
Yeah, I think there's a real opportunity for folks to be able to learn. I think there's been a real appetite for that. It's unfortunate what it takes to get us to that point, but there are folks who are overt, in your face, sort of racist, things like that. We saw that in Charlottesville in August 2017. That's not our target audience at the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities. If we have the opportunity to work with members of those groups, certainly we will. But I think there's a large segment of our population that wants to do the right thing, that wants to be in an environment where they can be their full selves and wants that for their neighbors, their coworkers, their classmates. But they don't necessarily know how to do that, or they're not even aware of the ways they might be slighting or harming someone else. You talked about name changes. We facilitated a conversation this past July for several stakeholders at a school in Virginia that was talking about changing their mascot name. And they brought together some alumni, some administrators, teachers. We did it on Zoom and had a guided conversation where they could share their perspectives as the school was making a decision they wanted to hear from different stakeholders. And one of the things that was really striking in that conversation to me was the perspective of one of the folks who was an alumnus of the school, who had a great experience, helped to set up an alumni association, and was adamant that the mascot name should not change. And one of the reasons he said that as a white male was, he said, if you are telling me that the mascot name needs to change because it's racist, then you're saying that me and every one of my fellow alumni who had a good experience at the school is racist because we essentially supported or went along with it. And a black male alumnus who was also part of the panel said, absolutely not. This is not about you as an individual. This is about saying, I'm thrilled to know that you had a great experience. I want you to hear that my experience wasn't as great, in part because every day when I walked into the school, I saw out front this name of the mascot that told me that this wasn't a place where I could fully be myself or belong. And I think that type of conversation is so missing in our society right now. We have such an empathy gap. We have such a divide in terms of folks just being able to engage with the quote unquote other, whatever that means in terms of perspective, identity, et cetera. So our work, I think, for our team at the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities is really bridging some of those divides, not avoiding the conversation, because we've seen what avoiding it has done. It's perpetuated the problem. We need to engage with one another, learn from one another, and then I think develop sustainable solutions that advance equity and inclusion and justice.
And it is a process. We're not going to flip a switch or take a pill and cure it, because it took hundreds of years to get us here. So it's not going to be cured in a day. But I will say that people can be open to acknowledging that they don't know what they don't know, and that you can be open to hearing about an experience that you don't think is yours. So, I sat for many years, I sat on the board of Equality Virginia. I mean, through all of the turmoil and 10 years of not being able to get employment non-discrimination passed in the Commonwealth of Virginia, like how is that not possible? But, when the whole issues around transgender individuals came to light, and especially in schools, and that's the work Equality Virginia continues to do, is work in schools around issues about gender identity, not just sexual orientation, but gender identity. But so many people thought they didn't know a gay person, including Congressman Portman, who didn't think he knew a gay person. He was so anti same-sex marriage until his son came out. So we need to ask ourselves, is it that we don't know, or we don't have the experience, or that people don't share with us, whether in the disability community, or they're a woman of color, or they're transgender, or whatever, is that they do not feel comfortable actually being their authentic selves with people who believe that they are their friends.
Yeah.
That's the question we need to be asking ourselves. Are we as individuals even open to what other people's experiences are? And I say this here in Fairfax City, Mayor Scott Silverthorne, who is a friend of mine and who was mayor here, went through some terrible trouble. And, and he is still here among us, and he is still much beloved. But, was it him, or was it his belief that we would not accept him? And so we have to ask ourselves, what was our role in the drama that played out there? And I'm not sure there's a lot of people sitting around going, what was my role? I'm not sure. And I'm hoping that the VCIC actually is saying, let's sit in a room and let's facilitate or talk about the ways in which you can be more open to understanding the world around you and the people in it. So for those of you who might just be joining us, this is Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. And it is my great honor to be speaking with Jonathan Zur, who is the president and CEO of the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, and the work that they are doing across the Commonwealth of Virginia to help all of us understand in our communities, in our schools, in our places of business, our places of worship, how we can be better citizens and make a community that truly works for everyone. You talked about your tolerance trio, which I love that. It sounds like it should be a movie, sort of like, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, but kind of like with a different twist. But, be a good title for a movie about the tolerance trio. But, let's talk about Black churches. Black churches in the Commonwealth of Virginia, historically powerhouses for their own communities. So support, social services, just a place that was safe. And so a friend of mine, Amanda Ondere, likes to say that the most segregated place in the world is church on Sunday morning. And so, what do you find, since your history was based in sort of interfaith tolerance, and where we are with trying to integrate communities like historically Black churches, historically Black universities, HBCUs, where do we go from here?
Well, I think, Catherine, part of what you're describing there, we think about at VCIC is sort of the difference between diversity, inclusion, and equity. And so diversity, what we're talking about is really the presence of difference. So you have two people in a room, you're going to have some level of diversity. That doesn't mean they get along. That doesn't mean they're nice to each other. And writ large, we can see that there are times like the Sunday morning example where many folks, if they are worshiping at that time, don't see a whole lot of diversity within their house of worship. And that's a moment, I think, to ask some questions and to do some reflection and to interrogate how did that happen? Not that we actively excluded, although in some cases that has been the case, but we also haven't intentionally included. We haven't reached out beyond our traditional circle. And maybe when we did, we had someone who came to our house of worship once or twice, didn't feel like they belonged. So that's where we start to get into the inclusion piece. And so ultimately didn't come back or didn't have a good experience. And then when we start to look at equity, we can think about what are the policies, what are the structures that might have created an environment. So there was a time when segregation was the practice, formally and informally, within Virginia. And we inherit the residue of that and will continue to well into the future. And so I think that we need to really start to explore, where are our spaces diverse and when are they not? Where are the opportunities for us to connect with folks who are different? Brian Stevenson, who founded the Equal Justice Initiative, has a great framework that he moves through. He talks about the idea of proximity, and we're not always proximate to those who are different. So that's a foundational step, leading to the possibility of relationship, leading to the possibility of empathy, leading to the possibility of justice. And that's not a straight line, and it's not always guaranteed to go to the next step. But we need to really think at each of those levels. How do we make sure we are proximate to those who are different? How do we build trusting, authentic relationships that can lead to empathy and ultimately then result in a greater sense of justice for all?
That is fantastic. Of course, I love Brian Stevenson anyway. But that's a great note on which to end this segment. Please join us after this break as we will continue to talk with Jonathan Zur of the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities.
This is Radio Fairfax, a public access cable and internet station provided by Fairfax Public Access, a 501c3 organization in Fairfax County, Virginia.
Al Cooper, Brooks Williams, Al Stewart, Cheryl Wheeler, Barlow Guthrie, Chris. Contemporary singer-songwriter folk artists side by side with long-standing esoteric rock performers. That's what Eclectic Hours is. It's music for baby boomers, music where you gotta listen to the words. Eclectic Hours, Sunday mornings from 10 a.m. to noon. James Taylor, Kate Campbell, Joe Cocker, Livingston Taylor, Lucy.
Free for Me, bringing you musical gems rarely heard on the radio. Hear the White Stripes, St. Vincent, and the Hot Melts. Free for Me, Tuesday at 5 on Radio Fairfax.
Let's go down into the subway station where you hear the strangest things. Every Saturday at 4 o'clock on Night Train Memories, Sounds of the Cities.
Hope you enjoyed your meal. And I just want to say, he's lucky to have a brother like you.
Lucky? Caring for my brother is far from easy. But he's a part of me, like my arms and legs, so I'll be his. No time for tired. Nothing can disable this love. He needs me, but I'm the lucky one, even though I need help now and then.
If you're caring for a loved one, visit aarp.org/caregiving for care guides and community. Support for your strength. Brought to you by AARP and the Ad Council.
Social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Want to hear what there is in jazz besides usual big names? Come listen to The Outer View, where you'll hear vocalists, pianists, jazz rock, jazz from foreign countries, and much more, going all the way from the mainstream to the cutting edge. The exploring happens on The Outer View with Jerry Howard, Tuesdays 2 to 3 on Radio Fairfax.
Wake up and text. Text and eat. Text and meet up with a friend you haven't seen in forever.
Hi.
Oh, hey. Text and complain that they're on their phone the whole time. Text and listen to them complain that you're on your phone the whole time. Text and whatever. But when you get behind the wheel, give your phone to a passenger. Put it in the glove box. Just don't text and drive. Visit StopTextsStopWrecks.org. A message from NHTSA and the Ad Council.
If doctors told us that we'd made a breakthrough on COVID-19, we would rejoice. We'd feel hope that we could live our lives again, get back to work, back to doing what we want. Well, masks are a ticket to that freedom. We can help protect others and save lives by covering our noses and mouths, which is how the virus mainly spreads. Until there's a vaccine, grab the breakthrough that's already here. When we're out, it's masks on. A message to help keep you safe.
Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Welcome back to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we're talking with Jonathan Zur, who is the president and CEO of the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities. This is a statewide organization here in Virginia that's actually been doing this work for 85 years. And if you have not heard of them, then you are not alone, because neither did I. So it's been a pleasure to be able to talk to you about these things, Jonathan. I think more people are looking for opportunities to learn, genuinely learn. And I think a lot of people are more open to the fact that they don't know what they don't know, but then where do you go? And so I'm interested in the fact that you actually have a program that you've set up for 2021. It's on your website, and talk a little bit about how you developed these different sessions and who they're for and how people engage.
Absolutely. One of the program series that we're most proud of is our Workplace Inclusion Network, or our WIN program. And this brings together organizations or businesses. Historically, it has been centered in the Richmond area, but one opportunity that we have by going virtual is that we have had folks in the last year, and we hope in 2021, who can participate from all over the Commonwealth. And so we bring together folks who are either doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, or who are committed to these issues within their spheres of influence for 90-minute sessions every other month, where we are focusing this year on the themes of empathy and equity. And we think that those are two really important topics for folks to focus on, to consider how do I build a workplace or organizational culture where there is a sense of empathy. We talked about this before the break, the idea of really seeking to understand someone's lived experience, make meaning of the similarities or differences. And so in a facilitated program or professional development session, we'll ask people to do some self-reflection, to think about, for example, the first time you became aware of your race, or the first time you became aware that your race might affect how you were treated in society, or what were some of the early messages you received about people of different sexual orientations, and how might that have shaped then your perspective on issues connected to the LGBTQ plus community today. So there would be some self-reflection, but then we would think and then give folks the chance to chat with others, identify where there are trends or themes, consider then what their organizations can do to create a climate where folks can think about and talk about these things in healthy and safe ways. I think one of the big ahas for corporations in particular this past summer was the recognition that saying we don't talk about these issues in the workplace, leave your personal life at the door, didn't mean that people were leaving their personal lives at the door. It meant that some people had forced to keep their mouths shut in order to survive, and others had the false perception that everyone was happy and getting along, when in fact that wasn't the case. And so creating an empathy culture is not about avoiding disagreements. It's about creating a culture where we can really understand one another. On the equity side, the professional development sessions will focus on actual policy. So can we look at your personnel policy manual and review it and think about what are the practices that might foster a climate that tells some people they fully belong and other people that they may not. One very tangible, maybe small example, but I think is meaningful, is we worked with an organization that had in their paid holidays, their paid leave time, Good Friday as one of the holidays. As they became an increasingly diverse organization. They had folks from a range of religious backgrounds, several of whom said, I don't mind having a day off for Good Friday, but it really doesn't mean anything to me. And hey, it'd be nice if I had off for Eid or off for Yom Kippur, or off for some Juneteenth. And so that organization was able to look at their policies and say, let's take that paid holiday of Good Friday and instead add one more personal day, which folks can use for Good Friday if that's meaningful to them, or for any number of other things, up to and including you need a mental health day. So I think there are things like that. That's a very small practical one. There are some bigger issues that would be harder to address, but I think it's important for organizations to be thinking at that level. Relationships are important, and structures and policies are important. And I think it's a both and rather than an either or when we're doing work around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right. And you mentioned early in the program that, it's well known that diversity training doesn't really make an impact, because you can tell somebody something the way it should be, but if they're not in a culture where that's practiced or embraced or valued or lived every day, then it doesn't matter if you know the right thing to do, if your culture is sending you an entirely different signal. I was interested, my husband's law firm, 2 months ago, and it's a big global law firm, sent something out inviting all of their staff, their attorneys and their staff, to put the pronouns they use in their email signature. Now, you didn't have to do that, but a lot of people did do that. But what they were basically signaling is that we are acknowledging that you have the right to say how you should be addressed as they or she or he. And it was important for that to come from the very topmost person in a global organization to say, we are acknowledging that people see themselves a certain way, and we want to offer the respect. And the other thing about that is that it's not just internal, but having it in your email signature is the law firm saying to the clients that are getting those emails, this is what our law firm values, that we expect you to show respect to our people based on how they're telling you they wish to be addressed. And that's, you say, well, those are small things, but these are the building blocks of the big things.
They certainly are. And organizations, all the research shows that organizations that are not just diverse, but that are inclusive and equitable are organizations that are more successful. And so a law firm that takes that action that you just described is likely to have a much higher satisfaction level from their transgender, gender nonconforming employees, or folks who are family members or friends of folks in the trans community. What does that mean? That results in more productivity. That results in higher rates of retention. That results in people caring about the quality of their work more. And so, yes, there, I believe, is a social, moral, ethical reason to do this. And organizations, I think, also can show that when they engage in these proactive and explicit displays of intentional inclusion, they are going to see over time a much better outcome within their organization. But that requires consistency, that requires focus and structure to be able to put that into place. This isn't the type of thing that we can bounce from crisis to crisis. So now this is our priority and we're going to deal with this. Oh, but 6 months from now, nope, we're moved on to another social issue. And so we're not talking about this anymore. If we have an infrastructure in place and we can help organizations and do help school districts and communities to think about, what is your long range plan? What are some quick wins that you can engage in? But what is your long-term strategy to be able to really foster more equitable outcomes?
For those of you who are just joining us, this is Making Change Radio. And the change maker we're talking with today is Jonathan Zur, who leads a wonderful organization called the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities. And the work they are doing is around equity and justice. And the program for this year is all about equity and empathy. And they work with communities, they work with schools, they work with businesses. And I think it's important for people to have a place where if you're going to say that there's a problem, so working in business, somebody says, we have a problem. It's kind of like, so what is your suggested solution? I think it's very helpful for people to go in and say, I think there would be room for improvement. And this is a resource that I have found. It might be a resource that could be helpful. So, I think more employees, or no matter where you work, or a community organization, or I work with a lot of nonprofits, you need to feel like you can be in an environment where you can say, I think we can be better. And this is a resource for helping us to be better.
And I think that folks need to be okay, I think, naming that. And we need to create workplace cultures where folks feel comfortable speaking up. They don't feel like they're taking a risk or they're going to be penalized for speaking up when they have a concern. So I think one of the things we help organizations and institutions to think about are whose voices are at the table, who's not at the table, who is at the table, but we're not hearing them, or they're not able to fully speak up, or their perspectives are being talked over or co-opted or taken by others. So that becomes an important piece in terms of our workplace culture. But then once we hear that information, once we hear that there's a concern, a lot of times folks don't know where to start. And so we're proud to be a resource. We have on our website, if folks go to inclusiveva.org, there's a resources section, which includes articles, includes best practices. In June of 2020, we added a section that was about how to talk to your children about current events and how to talk in the workplace about current events, so that folks were able to set up structures to be able to make those conversations and that learning really meaningful. So we weren't just putting it on people of color to have to hold the emotional baggage of telling their stories. We also weren't talking over people or creating more harm, but really, how do we create a safe, productive, healthy conversation that leads to learning and leads to action? We also put on our website a day after election guide that we developed related to the 2020 election season, because we saw in 2016 a 1,300% increase in crisis requests after incidents of bias, bullying, and discrimination that took place really in the 2 months prior to the 2016 election, and then in the immediate aftermath, where in schools and workplaces, houses of worship, localities, folks were saying things, folks were doing things that were incredibly hurtful and offensive to members of the Muslim community, LGBT community, immigrants, Black or African American community, Jewish community, et cetera. And so this year, 2020, we said, or last year now, 2020, we said, we need to put together a guide so that folks can prepare for the election rather than wait for a crisis. And so we put together resources around what is your communication going to look like? What are the legal considerations around allowing certain viewpoints or not in schools? What if a student puts in their virtual background candidate's logo? Is that allowed or is that not allowed? And how do you make sure to know that in advance? What should teachers be doing in the classroom setting? How do we support student clubs and organizations? And the biggest thing that we told schools was a crisis is the worst time to try to start building trust. So let's do that work throughout the school year so that if you do have an incident, it's not going to prevent everything, although it can prevent a lot. If you do have an incident, you have a foundation upon which to build. And so those resources are still on our website. And many schools have said, even though the election has passed, these are still great tips and tools that we're going to use with our teachers throughout the year to make sure that we are proactively getting ahead of what some call teachable moments that could come up in the classroom.
And you hit on it. This puts me in mind of restorative justice, which is a practice in the classroom that I wish more people understood, more teachers were trained for, because it does require training to do something like a restorative justice circle. But the whole concept, and I've done shows on that before too, the whole concept of teaching a 5-year-old things about who has been harmed and how you work your way back from being the perpetrator or the victim, and how you resolve things rather than being punitive. These basic concepts also fit right into developing empathy and building a sense of equity among in the smallest children. If they learn how to resolve things in a different way, in a different structure, that is not simply somebody gets punished, you just look for the wrongdoer. I mean, that doesn't solve the problem at all. And so I don't know if in the future there will just be more talk along with the work that you're doing, that there needs to be Roots of Empathy actually is a program, I think, out of Canada. The Bishop Walker School for Boys is the first place I heard about the Roots of Empathy program, because they use it there. And I was thinking, well, that's fantastic. Why aren't we doing that everywhere? But along with that Roots of Empathy program and the principles behind it, it also follows restorative justice. All these things are related.
Definitely.
So how do we raise this up and help people understand what it is and why we need to raise it up and make it a more critical part of how we're trying to long-term change cultures in schools and organizations and even law enforcement?
Well, I think that there are some really important things that can be done to help folks understand how, when we set those foundations, we end up with better outcomes. So there's a teacher that I can think of that went through some intensive professional development that our organization provided, one of our summer intensive retreat experiences. And then she said she spent the first 10 days, 2 weeks of the school year building classroom community. She said all of her colleagues in her department said, you're out of your mind. Like, you're already 2 weeks behind on the pacing guide with SOLs and standards and all of this. How are you going to make up that time? And what she said is she ended up having better outcomes and having a better experience because she didn't have to do all of the discipline that she was having to do in the past. That when she created group assignments, students had already worked out who they felt comfortable working with and not, and what their personality type was, and those types of things. So that foundational work helped to result in better outcomes, whereas her colleagues were constantly dealing with discipline challenges and hadn't done that work. The same thing, you mentioned police. The same thing is true in terms of our law enforcement. And we need to think about that at both of those levels around what we talked about earlier, relationships as well as structures and policies. But a lot of that goes back to, what is the role of police within a community? Why is it that I, as a white person, was taught to trust the police and do whatever a police officer says? And I have friends of color who say that they were taught something very different, and not for incorrect reason, because their family members had lived experiences that were very hurtful and painful. That needs to be part of the conversation rather than us staying in our silos. I think writ large, what we have in society is a moment when folks have so much information they can access that they are now getting curated information that only affirms what they already believe rather than hearing a different perspective. And there's a documentary now on Netflix, The Social Dilemma, that looks at this idea of how our social media is curated. But ultimately what it means is that I believe something and all I'm seeing is information that affirms what I believe rather than complicating it by introducing the fact that there are different perspectives and lived experiences. And while that is harder and that's messier, it's also much more realistic. And if we're going to live in a pluralistic, diverse society, we do need to figure out how to expand our circles, our networks, rather than narrow them so that we're only talking to, hearing from, engaging with people who look like us, believe like us, think like us, etc.
Or in our bubble. I have not
Yes.
seen that movie, Social Dilemma, but my 33-year-old daughter did, and she said it scared her. It scared her a lot. So for those of you who are just joining us, this is Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and we're talking with Jonathan Zur, who is the president and CEO of the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about is vocabulary, because, for instance, when we first started using the term transgender, people didn't even know how to use that word, and so people are getting more comfortable as we talk about things like, let's say, for instance, equity and how that's different from equality. Mm-hmm. And so all of these, restorative justice. I mean, people have to learn a vocabulary and what it means. And we're also creating vocabulary so we can better and more accurately describe the things we're talking about. But one of the things like white privilege that are trigger things that put up walls around people who are like, I'm not privileged. And it's kind of like, so some of these terms are actually very difficult now to use because it's almost as if you're putting up this defensiveness or triggering this defensiveness because people are not really understanding that term the way it's being used right now in 2021. So what do you have to say about the evolution of vocabulary and how we even accurately talk about the things we're trying to resolve and solve and improve?
I think a few things. The reality is that as we learn more, as understanding increases, as relationships and empathy increase, that means then that there are going to be times where I have to learn, you have to learn, listeners have to learn that words we may have used may not be the appreciated or preferred word. And if I respond by getting defensive, if I respond by feeling guilty, if I make it about me, then I'm not actually, if I learn, for example, that I've slighted someone and now my focus is and my energy is all about me, I've missed the point. I haven't focused on the fact that there's someone else who has been harmed, whether I intended or not. So I think that's an area where folks really have to build some skills and do some self-reflection. And certainly there are ways to work that muscle, so to speak, through professional development or training opportunities. I also think that this is unfortunately going to be an area where we are always learning and growing and doing better. So if we think about the vocabulary, look at the census, for example. The labels that were used for racial categories in the census have changed every 10 years. Part of that is because race is a social construct, and we can go down that rabbit hole if you want. But a big part of that is because society has said this label is now the label we're used and that label is not. Or around LGBTQ plus, the labels and identities are constantly evolving. And we see this most in our work with schools, where sometimes we're learning from middle school and high school students new labels or pronouns. And I think that that's really an opportunity rather than a burden. To say, how do we, in a society that is getting more and more diverse, the reality is that that's happening. The demographic trends tell us that. It will continue to be the case. That means that we're going to have to learn more, that we're going to have to prioritize being intentional in the same way that we do that around any number of other things. I don't have the same computer that I had from 20 years ago. And if I did, I wouldn't say that I've done, I'm not doing great. That's constantly evolving. We're constantly have to learn new technology. We're constantly having to learn new ways of engaging with one another. And we have to constantly learn new ways of doing better at being inclusive with our neighbors.
And I think context has changed. When you think about the Washington football team, and we think about it a lot around here because they're like right here. And so, there was lots of arguments and divisive, unproductive conversations around their name. Same with the Cleveland Indians. And suddenly what happened that changed things was not that people changed their minds, but the context changed. A lot of people who were willing to give it a pass, or it wasn't important, or why are we talking about this? What does it matter? Suddenly that changed. And so I think people need to understand that context is going to continue to change. And especially as this new generation, younger people, take center stage and are in decision-making positions, they don't understand why a lot of this is the way it is. And I fault history for that. Going back to all of these Civil War monuments, I keep saying it was 4 years out of 4 centuries. This is not rewriting history. It's like, can we just talk about all the other things too? And I think young people don't understand how we got here because we have had a very white-driven narrative about the exceptional, patriotic, manifest destiny of our culture and our history, and it's been damaging. And so now that's changing, and people like Hannah Nicole Jones is doing the 1619 Project to say, you have to understand how we ended up here so you can understand why it can't continue. Who's being harmed? We're all being harmed, actually, in the end.
There was a commission that the Commonwealth formed last year that I had the honor of serving on that was focused on African-American history education. And they put us into 2 subcommittees. When I was initially asked, I said, I am not an historian. This is not, I'm totally supportive of what you're doing, but I'm not sure it's my area of expertise. And they said, no, we're going to have 2 subcommittees. So you can be on the other subcommittee, not the historian. So they had some top-notch, brilliant historians, Dr. Ed Ayers, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, Christy Coleman, big names in Virginia who know inside and out these issues. And they went line by line through the state standards and found where there is blatant misinformation, where there is misleading information, or where the story starts midway through so you don't get the full picture, where there are gaps in what's being told, and put together a really remarkable set of recommendations that are now going through the process to be able to update state standards, which likely will then result potentially in updated textbooks or resources that are available for schools, has the potential to be transformational. The other committee which I had the opportunity to serve on, was focused on how do we support school culture and climate to be able to now learn about and talk about this history, which has been missing from our narratives up until this point. Because some educators are going to be ready, some communities are going to say it's about time, and others are going to say, I learned it this way, and I believe that to be true, and I don't want my child to get this new information. Nicole Hannah-Jones' work in the 1619 Project has come under really some controversy and critiques about whether it's historically accurate or not, and whether there's an agenda. And she openly says, yes, she has an agenda, but it's also misleading to say that our history textbooks up until this point have not had an agenda.
They had an agenda. They did.
So I think we need to both make sure that the information is accurate and that we are providing the supports and context to have those important, more accurate conversations.
And I just want to say, we've got a couple of minutes left, that there's lots of small ways that people can do this on their own. I saw something that Nancy Pelosi has decided they're going to ungender terms used in Congress. In other words, someone has a spouse, not husband and wife. Someone has a sibling, not a brother or sister. Let's talk about parents, not mom and dad. And I know that Mark Levine actually went through this Virginia State Code to ungender so many of the terms used in the Virginia State Code for that very reason. We don't have to use gendered terms. We can be incredibly specific and accurate by using ungendered terms. And it's like when I'm working with childcare advocates, so many people call it daycare. It's not daycare, it's childcare. We're taking care of children here, but you think that's such a small thing, but not for the people who are working in these spaces. It's not small. And so we as individuals need to look at the ways we can change our own vocabulary or our own perspective. And all of us are capable of growth. Let's face it, all of us can grow. I want to thank you, Jonathan. This has been the best hour, honestly. I've loved every minute of it. And I hope that we can come back together again sometime and do a follow-up show.
Thank you. I would love that. It's been a real treat, Catherine.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to remind people that they can find all of your information at www.inclusiveva.org. And they can also find you on Twitter at InclusiveVA and on Instagram at @inclusive_VA. And you have a YouTube channel. So all the social places that people are like, where do I find more information about the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities? You are all over social media. And I encourage people to follow your pages, look for the information, and figure out how they can best use your resources. So that's it for us, Making Change Radio, every Thursday at 9 p.m. here on Radio Fairfax.